I just want to say thank you. I'm joined on stage here by an excellent panel. And as David said, we want to have a conversation. So I just want to remind all of us here as well that it's all right to kind of jump in. You don't have to wait for me to ask a question, but really we want to comment and have a conversation here. And one of the topics that we have seen repeatedly referred to throughout the day, and something that's really key to us in our work at STM, but I know in each of our member organizations as well, is research integrity. And so we thought we might actually begin by talking about some topics and things that are important to us in relationship to that. And if I might, I'll kind of turn first to you, Stephen. We have, I think this is where we've said earlier today, this is not about competition really as such. We all have a shared interest in building research integrity together. And if you look from your perspective in Springer Nature, what are kind of a couple of real key areas that we share together and where by coming together we can approach this better together than separately? And I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. I think at the minute we've got a bit of a varied view on how significant the problem of research integrity is at this moment. I think there's a building awareness. It reminds me a little bit of when we all started waking up to the threat of cybersecurity and the phrase, there's two types of customers. One knows that they're under attack, the other that just isn't aware, but they are under attack as well. And I think for many publishers, and certainly Springer Nature, we are seeing attacks coming from many places. Once it was about errors and omissions and perhaps a few shortcuts with plagiarism needing to be checked. At the moment, there are criminals and bad actors attacking us. They've seen money in the system and they can work out how to get a share of it under fraudulent means. And there are fake identities out there, there are fake articles out there, there are systematic paper mills in many different countries that we can trace down. And if you look on the dark web, there are tips on how to do this being exchanged by criminals in order to target the system. So let's be in no doubt that this is a huge challenge for us as publishers because we've always relied on trust in the system and people doing what they say and only needing to check to make sure it was done well enough to meet our standards. I think the biggest tools we've got for this are, first of all, the expertise, knowledge and relationships that we have. Secondly, there is increasing investment in tools and technology to take advantage of that in a more systematic way. And thirdly, and it's perhaps one thing that we'll all talk a bit more about, is how we all work together in a safe way. STM Solutions is the obvious vehicle for that. I see great support across all the publishers that are becoming aware of it, seeing that a safe way to share anonymized data so that we can see patterns, identify the problems, and have a common investment to level the playing field for all sizes of publishers to be able to deal with this, because nobody cares whether you're a good bank in a financial crisis. Nobody will care if you're a good publisher in a publishing crisis. And this goes right to the heart of our mission and responsibility.
There's also an interesting thing that came out. We've been doing interviews with a number of stakeholders as a part of our work towards a new strategy for STM. And one comment that's come out from multiple places, but not just publishers, but other stakeholders, is there's a recognition that there's been almost an outsourcing of some of this activity around research integrity to publishers. And we've accepted some accountability about grappling with those issues. But when we've been working as STM with COPE, on this paper on paper mills, it's become evident that we actually need other stakeholders to work with us. And I'm curious if Judy or Jay or Mandy, have you been working or have you been involved, or your organization's involved with any other stakeholders or conversations, or any thoughts about which stakeholders do we need to help support us? Because it's not just our problem, is it? It's a bigger problem.
I think Jay would be perfect to talk about paper mills.
Well, all right.
No one wants to do it.
No, let's not shy away from it. I think Stephen made a couple of good points, but just to underline them for a second, I mean, I don't think it goes to the heart of our mission. I think this question goes to the heart of our value proposition as an industry. At the very heart of the value proposition is the quality of content that gets published. At the very heart of the value proposition is our role in assuring that content. And we have, in effect, said to various stakeholders, if it's funders, if it's librarians, that the peer review process is at the dead center of what we do and the value that we deliver and co-create. It's what underpins our pricing. It's what underpins our reason for doing this. And so to let that attack, as Stephen described it, I think properly, go unanswered is an unacceptable position from my point of view. But I want to get to the scale question that you asked earlier. A concern that I have, and we talk to a lot of society publishers who stand on their own and publish independently. We talk to a lot of folks who are interested in partnering with one of us up here and other organizations. I have a concern that smaller organizations who don't have the millions and the tens of millions to invest in these tools will be left outside of that evolution that we need to make as an industry. And so I'm very supportive of the STM solutions approach, but I also think that we can't shy away. You know, it's been outsourced to us. I'm happy for us to step into that because I think it does solidify our value proposition. We can't shy away from it, but we have to understand the unintended consequences of relying on one set of actors in the ecosystem, namely large publishers, to do this. We need to be doing this on behalf of our industry.
So I'm quite conscious that while I'm on this panel, I'm on quite a different scale to the other panelists. And so I probably feel some of the pain that Jay is describing, that we really see that when fraud is has gone onto a different scale and has become much more systematic, so do the solutions need to become so. And that's really critical. And so how we can collaborate both together, but I think also with the university sector. How can we make sure that we're working with university research integrity offices, for example, I think is really important. But I think that point you were making, Jay, about for smaller publishers, how can everybody make sure that we're taking this seriously and able to respond, I think is absolutely right. And I do think the solutions that are being created are part of that solution, us all talking about it and making sure that collectively we work to stamp this out. We know it's probably going to be slightly whack-a-mole. We're never going to be able to get rid of this problem entirely, but I think by having more systematic solutions, we are going to be collectively much stronger.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Judy, or how we
No,
covered?
I think other than the fact the huge societal impact, if we don't get on top of this, I think we all understand, and COVID put exclamation points after it, the critical importance of quality research getting out there. And we have to work together to make sure that always takes place, so.
And can I say, building to that, because we also asked folks if they wanted to submit some questions, and a question that had come through is how can we demonstrate to readers and customers that our content is trustworthy? And I think that one of the things that I'm hearing, we know that just one thing slips through, it can risk kind of that overall trust in science, which we know that also our customers are grappling with. Our researchers themselves are concerned about the fact that there is a distrust in science. And we heard that this morning actually from Peter Gluckman. How might we then be working to rebuild that? Because clearly there are these threats out there, and despite the best efforts we're doing now and our continued efforts, it is undermining that. How can we as an industry be rebuilding that trust? I know, tough question. I didn't send it in advance, so they weren't able to prepare.
That's an absolutely huge question, and from an Elsevier side of the equation, and we have partnered with the Economist Impact and Sense About Science and some other global partners on a whole study on confidence in research. And as part of that study, we've actually worked with over 3,100 researchers in all kinds of survey modes to get underneath what the big challenges are, and we will be publishing that report November 6th to get out there. But it's really clear, too, from the preliminary stuff we're seeing, is researchers are very much feeling that pain because it undermines their own credibility, number one. And number two, another part of the pain that they're feeling, and I believe us as a community of publishers and societies need to help, is how to deal with a lot of the backlash that researchers personally get on social media and how to help them there. So it's kind of a multifaceted opportunity in terms of how we can work together. But I'll look forward to getting this research out to everyone because I think it will benefit us all as we figure out, as we go and drive forward into the future, how to enable here better.
Yeah, I was thinking there were kind of two audiences we need to tackle in terms of trust. There's one, the research community itself, and I think the more we can be open about what we're doing and be seen with the solutions that we're providing and how we're approaching that, and I think step by step, just as Judy has said, we can make improvements on the trust, but through that openness that we've all been talking about. The biggest problem sometimes recently with research, where there's been big cases of fraud in research, I think has been in the wider population. People get these big headlines in the newspapers, you can't trust researchers because look at this terrible study, it's all been made up. That's not something we're going to be able to address quickly, and I think that is a joint problem for us to work with researchers on together, because it's a joint problem, not just something that we need to tackle. I think step by step, we need to work first of all on our trust with the research community itself, and then together on the wider issue of trust in research.
Certainly, I agree with all of those points. I think we've got to look at the systemic issues as well as the criminals that are infiltrating the system. They'll grab the headlines, but the systemic issues go back to some of the things Anthony's always championed about, early career stage researchers and so on. The pressure that people are feeling and the inappropriate rules that some are forced to comply with. We know that a significant contributor are some of the rules in China around doctors and the need to publish research in order to be able to advance their careers. And the reality is, you look at their patient lists, you look at their workloads, it is impossible. So that was one of the genesis of the authorship for sale market that is really quite prevalent on the dark web, if you take a look. And we've got to get rid of the stimulants that drive those behaviours, as well as close the doors on the places where they're getting into our systems or into our journals, and in some cases conference proceedings. And so I think it's partly about what we have to do, and it's partly about sharing back to the communities what we can see and trying to help them normalise and get sorted the things that drive people to these extreme levels in order to just try and get by.
One quick comment from me. I think I would like to see us embrace the challenge of bringing technology to bear on this problem in a way that moves us beyond the state-of-the-art of 1998, 1999, with which we currently deliver the artifacts of scholarly research. And I say this as someone who in 1998, 1999 was involved at the ground level in that first migration from print to digital. We have, for a generation, skipped out on a cycle of innovation. We do not write for the medium. We do not support writing for the medium. We don't integrate the data, the methods, the code. We don't structure it. We don't build in the automated checks that researchers themselves use when they're setting up experiments or running those experiments in the virtual setting. There's an incredible amount of technology that we can bring to bear, but we have to break our reliance on the version of record being a PDF article and move it into a linked, checked, badged, interoperable, state-of-the-art system. Because without that, anybody can impersonate, anybody can change, anybody can hack, and we're not really getting the full benefit of the medium that our users, researchers, authors, librarians to some degree, are having in the rest of their life, that they're having in the lab, that they're having as consumers, et cetera. So I think we've met the enemy and he is us in some ways. And I feel like we need to really push the innovation envelope because there are solutions that are available to us.
How do you think we could better collectively get there, Jay?
Standards.
That,
Have you got a list of standards we need?
Well,
Yoris, take
no,
notes.
But I'll give you an anecdote, right? So we've been thinking a lot about, at Wiley, the way that we want to turn text into data when articles are submitted to us. The state of the art in most of the submission systems don't field or master most of the information that's collected when you submit an article. And so we've been thinking like, hey, how do you embrace this fielding and this data enrichment aspect? So we took a look at a tranche of journals and we said, how many questions do we ask the authors when they submit? Wiley had 55,000 unique questions that we asked authors when they submit. Not all the same author, but in a field, right, we have one, this is a blinded study, this is a controlled study, this is a placebo-controlled study, this is a study in humans, this is a study in live humans, this is a study in, and with all the will in the world, I don't think there are 55,000 things, unique things, that we would want to ask authors before they were allowed to submit. That's to say nothing of fielding methods or establishing reproducible standards or badges. So there are many, many opportunities, I think, for us to move that forward, but we need to convene the academics and the researchers and the societies who can convene the researchers together to decide on those standards. Because, again, all the will in the world, I think we all know that there are entrenched opinions about these things that IP owners need to resolve. But I think across the industry, if we were to standardize those things, it would lead us to a more reproducible future.
And so there's a couple of things I hear in what you're talking about. I wonder if you might be able to pick up on. I think that you are hinting at some of these elements that we've talked about in the previous session today with open science, that they really kind of support battling the research integrity breaches that we see, because it will be much more difficult to do devious things if you've also got, it's a whole lot more work if you've also got to fake a data set and you've got to fake your method and you've got to, so is this where that open science imperative also comes to play to help support with research integrity?
Again, coming back to the topic of scale. Stephen mentioned verifying identity. We know at Wiley that when we did our first really nationwide transitional agreement project deal in Germany, we had to invest millions just to figure out who the authors of these papers were. And that's 9,000, 10,000 papers a year out of Germany. I don't believe that is a problem that every member of this audience should try and solve on his or her own. And I don't think there's sufficient scale in most of the organizations here to invest that money to solve them on their own. So core, who's writing, who's reviewing, who's making acceptance decisions, to whom are we granting decision rights? That's a very profound problem in an age of an APC-driven economy. And I really feel like that's just one easy example of something that we could collaborate on as an industry and build solutions that work, that everybody can share.
Were there any other comments on that? Or, Judy, you look like
No,
you
I
wanted
was
to
just
say
going to say
something.
the theme is better together. No,
Yeah, because I think one of the things that I sense that we are moving towards was that we were each, I say we because I once was a publisher, but we're kind of doing absolutely everything ourselves in our own way. And even within our systems, if you had 100 journals, you, again, had 100 different ways of asking for information from authors. And I think there's both the standardization move, but it sounds like there's also, I think, a recognition that there are just certain things that aren't what we're going to compete on, right? That those things we can actually rather come together. One of them being stopping paper mills, or, it would be to all of our benefits to make this easier for authors and have some standardized ways. Is that, am I interpreting that correctly?
I would say absolutely 100% yes. Yeah, I think we all completely understand the areas where we don't compete and where we can collaborate. And I mean, one of the key things that we've been saying for a while is the researcher is our North Star. I mean, I've been saying that for a while. And we've got to work together to make sure that we make her life a lot easier. And there's so much that we can do. And again, tied in with enabling the researcher. And it's crazy that you have all these different formats. And even within our own companies, based upon the journals, you have different formats. I mean, those are solvable problems that we need to just get together and solve on behalf of this incredible community.
Just wildly agreeing. I mean, I think Jay's point about data. I mean, how many times are we all struggling to get the right data in the right format, in the right place that can speak to the other systems that we've got? I mean, the pace of change, the topic here, pace of change specifically around open access. We don't have the right data in the right places. It's making making that transition that as we've said earlier, we're also committed to, and yet the fact that we haven't got the data in the right places is making that harder. And if we can collaborate in some ways, make it easier for the researchers and easier for us, that's got to help everybody. And I think we'll show, coming back to that piece around trust, we'll show the research community that we're serious about shifting to open, rather than saying, oh, but it's really hard.
You know, and to me, there's another important societal piece here in terms of what we do. I mean, if you think about the fact, if it's taken the researcher or the author hours and hours and hours in terms of submitting to get published, that's time that's being taken away from potentially having a cure for cancer or getting another vaccine out sooner. And so to me, we've got a tremendous responsibility to enable that part of the research. So our researchers are spending their time in active research to solve critical problems in the world. So.
I'd also just add that a rather more mundane level, if we do cooperate and we do invest in a more central way to take advantage of the data, and it's an arms race. Researcher ID, authentication, absolutely. But sure, we've all come across it. Some of the fake IDs are actually people watching to see who's dying and taking up their IDs very quickly before they're on the system to know that that's no longer an active live researcher. And they're getting in there. So it's a constant arms race. So if we're going to be needing to keep up with that, we're going to have to invest an awful lot in a lot of technology. And then at least when we've done it, we can communicate that to the wider market. It's costing us tens of millions to do this, to protect all of you. And to protect ourselves as well, clearly, but to protect the research community and to ensure trust in the system. And I think up to now, because we've all been separate organisations, we've not been able to pool that knowledge, that information, those investment levels together in order to be able to communicate that. And if we are to ensure that we maintain trust, not just in the publications, but in publishers as the guardians of the system, then we're going to have to get a lot better at communicating that, especially if as we clean up what seems to have happened, we're going to have to get over that hump of being questioned by our critics about how could you have let that happen? Why was that allowed to be the case? Were you asleep at the wheel? And that's what I expect we're going to be going through in the next year or two as this is all sorted out.
Something else that we've noticed recently, we believe that in our open research platform, Cambridge Open Engage, we spotted one article, one preprint that's been from a paper mill. It's picked up through our normal plagiarism checks and the moderator system that we've got. But if paper mills are starting to submit to preprint systems, we can't just be thinking about the version of record. And I think us being, and in terms of micro publications as well, I think as we start to think about diversification of publication, we also need to think about how we're going to secure publishing and integrity in all of these different diverse forms of publication, as well as the standard version of record. And I think in terms of getting ahead of the game and not being accused of being asleep at the wheel, we need to be thinking quite expansively around research integrity.
I think that's a really important point. Before we move to a different topic, I do want to just recognize something that I'm not sure all of our stakeholders recognize, but I think because we've got some of the larger publishers on stage here, I think because of your volume, you perhaps detect things at an earlier stage than, for example, when I had a company, Coaction Publishing, was publishing 2,000 articles a year. I wouldn't be seeing the trends that I think you sort of see them before some of smaller entities. And I think that my sense has been, since I've come into my role, that I've recognized that there is among some of our larger members, a sense of, because you are publishing so much content, a kind of responsibility of also investing on behalf of others to build some of these solutions so that we can, provide something for others. And I know it's been already mentioned here, but for some of the smaller players as well, to be able to take advantage of that. So this is me just paying you a compliment and saying thank you, because I think there are a lot of people who don't recognize that there are some big investments being made from some of the bigger players in order to benefit for the whole system. Yeah.
Do the right thing.
To do the right thing and to recognize what's needed for all of us to succeed. Just before I move on to a different topic, is there anything else we may end up coming back to research integrity because it is such an important topic. Judy, you were talking a little bit about some things that trigger me to want to ask a little bit about elsewhere. This is a really different topic from research integrity, but you've been moving towards inviting others to join Science Direct, and I wanted to just ask a little bit about syndication agreements. Mm-hmm. And is this one of the trends we maybe see going forward? In essence, we know, for example, that folks might turn to some other platforms that we don't like, that are kind of in that negative space, because that's where they can find all the content. Is this a way of kind of battling that? And what is some of the thinking about that?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question, because it's another great example of publishers looking at creative ways to work together to enable the researcher. And going back to those two core beliefs, and I'll keep on saying them, that researchers are North Star, and when publishers and societies work together and collaborate, that's when we can accomplish great things on behalf of the researcher and the communities we serve. So February of this year, Elsevier started a pilot, and a syndication pilot leveraging Science Direct, which is, I think everyone probably is very much aware of Science Direct as a big platform. And this pilot is with Wiley, Taylor and Francis, ACS, RSC, and actually the International Union of Crystallography joined at a little bit later date. And just, crystallography means clear ice in Greek, just in case you want to know that crazy fact. I figured Jay would want to know that. He always likes that type of stuff. But anyway, the whole intention was to be able to bring these papers onto Science Direct, and it encompasses 90,000 papers, 10,000, articles, 10,000 of which are open access. And when you think about the why behind doing it, the why starts with the researcher, and how do you create a frictionless discovery process for the researcher, AKA make it easier for the researcher. And so we've had it up and running, as I said, since February, and there really are very clear benefits. From a publisher side of the equation, and I'd love to have Jay jump in. We look at it as there's two core benefits, and for a publisher, first one is have the content that we publish, that publishers publish, get further integrated into the researcher workflow, really key. And then second of all, when you think about the role of the publisher, it's all about getting our authors' content widely distributed. Well, this is an opportunity to distribute content to a wider audience. And really cool, since being Elsevier all of 5 months, been incredibly enamored with Science Direct, and a couple of my team members in the audience will verify that with exclamation points. But Science Direct, there are currently tens of millions of researchers annually on Science Direct, hundreds of millions of time, and I'm not exaggerating with those numbers, on an annual basis. And it also equates down to there are 600,000 searches a day. It gives you an idea of the scale of it. So there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage that scale on behalf of researchers and our authors. And when I look at just benefit from overall Elsevier side of the equation, for years our researchers have been telling us that, number one, Science Direct, we really like Science Direct, really like. We would love Science Direct if there was more content other than Elsevier on it. It would make a huge difference. So then when you think about all this coming together, I mean, I look at it as a win-win-win. It's a win for the researcher, making it easier for them in their discovery workflow. Makes it easier, better for a publisher to get content out there and show value. And obviously, it's positive from an Elsevier side of the equation. It makes sense. So again, to me, this is a tremendous opportunity and a really good example of how collaboration could potentially take you to the next level. And again, just an example. And I don't know, Jay, if you have any feedback or insights from being involved.
On the pilot, I think one of the really interesting questions that all of us in the industry need to think about answering is, where are users? How do we get to them most effectively? And in an open access world, do things like IP access authentication and shibboleth and some of the old gates that we would put, paywalls that we would put in front of content, are they as relevant as they used to be? And so we're experimenting in a number of different ways to sort of think about what's the next generation of aggregation. We all know the standard, big three aggregators in the Western world. Those embargoed modes, like with EBSCO or with Ovid or with ProQuest or Gale or those folks. How does that change in a world where the majority of the content is going to be CC BY? How does that change in a world where we're giving where researchers have an opportunity to repackage, remix, reuse content, and what objectives are they trying to meet when they do that? And so if it's bundling content together because there's a critical mass of researchers in one area, or if it's thinking about how do we take pieces of articles and put them together to solve a particular problem, or if it's text and data mining on behalf of the National Health Service in the UK during COVID, there are a million things that we need to be experimenting with as we unlock content. Those are some of the core benefits of the OA transition. And so if we have to figure out ways to deliver those benefits to end users as quickly as possible.
And fun part, the pilot is also leveraging GetFTR. And I think, as all of you understand, GetFTR is another cross-industry collaboration with Todd Toller out of Wiley, Ralph Youngman out of ACS. So another great example of the community working together on behalf of the research community.
Did you have something, Mandy?
Yeah, I was going to be slight devil's advocate
Good.
here, because I think Science Direct is synonymous with Elsevier, and so for smaller publishers there would be a concern that, whilst I totally agree with all the benefits that you've described in terms of user benefit, the loss of identity for a smaller publisher, the risk of that, and I think there's something for us all to work through, and it will be different choices for different publishers about how can we maximise the benefits of open and recognise the different way content is going to be used, but equally we are all different. We want to maintain our identity, and I think trying to find the sweet spot, there will be a different place for each. So I think there's some interesting choices we're all going to be making over the next few years as we really see how open content changes how people use our content, where they find it, what they want to do with it. But I think that this sense of who we are, how our identity is known and understood, and is going to change over time.
Yeah, the interesting thing is most of search, and I'm sure everyone knows this, starts on Google Scholar. And so I think that makes an important point. And to me, at the end of the day, I don't personally believe it matters where content is hosted, as long as we could provide that researcher with a frictionless experience.
If I might continue to just play devil's advocate, and this is just to give you an opportunity, I think, to address this. I think in our space, there are those that fear what looks to be monopolistic or what looks to become monolithic, and anything that looks big can seem a bit frightening. Are those some of the reactions you've had, or I'm hearing all of the benefits, and as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking this is sort of the airport for the different airlines to be coming in and out of, in a way.
That's the analogy we like to use.
Is it? Yeah.
Very much so. No, and again, I look at it as a tremendous opportunity, and there's stuff that you can do to make sure that, well, this isn't a branded Elsevier, it is content that's coming from Wiley, from Taylor and Francis. And again, to me, at the end of the day, it's getting the author's research out there. I mean, when you look at, and that's why I was given the traffic, I mean, tremendous traffic on there. So this is an opportunity from a communications perspective of research. So that's how we're looking at it.
Terrific.
And so if anyone wants to talk to us further about it, I've got people here with me that'd be happy to talk. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you going to be devil's advocate?
No, I'm not going to be devil's advocate. I'm going to more raise a question
Okay.
that I think certainly we thought about when we heard about it, and that's just how important is the data that goes with the usage. At one level, you do need to know how your how the content's being used, so you can meet your obligations with your authors and your editors that want to know what's going on. But at another level, there is a whole, in other industries, there is a whole change happening where the data exhaust is actually driving the business development, it's driving the new solutions and services, and I think it's just something that if there are to be changes like this, we need to have quite an open discussion about, so that people go into it with their eyes open, understanding what the trade-offs are and deciding if it's good for them or not good for them. But it doesn't take away from your core point of good for the researcher and good for those who want to be a part of it.
And I think you're spot on about collecting the data. It's really important to understand that.
Can I ask I was going to move on, but I want to ask another question, because TDM and text and data mining was mentioned, and I can see that, that's been a real challenge, because authors feel that want to engage in text and data mining, we see it growing. Oh, it's really difficult. I've got to go around to hundreds of publishers to get that permission rather than being able to just do. Is that something that are in the plans to provide a space for that? And that also makes me think you might have different opportunities for publishers to engage. We want to be there because we want people to be able to do text and data mining, but we want you to read the content over here for other purposes. Not to do product development for you here, but just some questions, if there's any thoughts there.
I think the key thing is it's a pilot and an opportunity to learn from other publishers and experience, but very much learn from researchers. Does it absolutely enable them? And what are the next generation features that would make their lives easier?
Thanks. Yeah, that sounds good. So let's move to yet another topic. And, we need to talk about what's happening in the United States. We can't leave that elephant in the corner over there. It's not really an elephant. It's more like a gorilla that's jumped out. And the big question is this really a turning point now in terms of open access? And I'd like to spend a little bit of time of talking about how your organizations are approaching this, reacting to that. And I wonder if I might start with you, Mandy, because I know that you've been quite successful with beginning to have some transformative agreements. You've had some experience both now with the United States, but how does that contrast with Europe? And what does this look like from the perspective of a university press?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that our experience necessarily represents all university presses. We've got a different approach to many others. So yes, as you say, we have been successful in completing a number of transformative agreements in the US. So we've got over 350 institutions now covered by transformative agreements, plus hundreds more affiliated sites. So we feel like we've got good coverage. So when we saw the Nelson memo, we welcomed it. We saw it as the first step in getting clarity on what the policy in the US is going to be in terms of open access. Because I think we've all been feeling there's been momentum building in open access in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe. But what exactly was going to be the position in the US has been unclear. So we feel that this is the first step. We're hearing from many of our library customers that we've seen that they want open access, even though there's not been a mandate. The fact that we've been able to get 350 institutions covered by TAs tells you there's an appetite for open access. So librarians want to be offering this option to their patrons. The challenge, of course, and what we're all aware of in the Nelson memo, is it doesn't say anything about funding. And so that next step of detail, I call it detail as if it's a small detail, and it's clearly a massive critical piece of information that needs to be worked through. That's what the librarians are also worried about. They welcome this, they're excited by it, that's what they're telling us, as long as there's money behind it. And as long as it's not going to lead to them being expected to find resources that they don't have. So I think we're seeing it as a real positive step in the process of getting more clarity. I wouldn't describe this as a turning point in many ways. I mean, I think, you know, the idea that we hadn't already hit the tipping point in open, it feels like that we've gone past that. You know, if the tipping point is a point when you could, you know, after which you can't turn back, we couldn't turn back in terms of open access. We're way past that, I feel. This is a positive thing that we should be embracing. It increases citations, it increases usage, it's good for everything we're trying to do as publishers. So making it work is really important. So let's see this as a real positive, and now let's get into the details of how it's going to work.
Yeah. And I think from that, Jay, did you want to comment on that?
do.
Sure.
I want to, first of all, you've had a tremendous amount of success, so I just want to congratulate you on that. I think the question of is it a tipping point is probably the most germane one. And you know, I remember having my first conversation about open access here in 1999. And so for those who are surprised by the direction of travel, I would just sort of say, like, we've known for a very, very, very long time which way this was trending. And as an organization that's done, you know, substantial amount of transitional agreements, one of the single biggest things that I worry about, to bring it back to this question of scale, is the unintended consequences of a fragmented transition landscape. The Australians want it done differently than the Californians want it done. The Californians want it done differently than Project Deal wants it done, who wants it done differently than JISC. JISC has a different perspective than France, who has a different perspective than Spain, who has a different perspective than Italy. To say nothing of the tax regime, to say nothing of the author validation requirements, to say nothing of how you price and the read-only institutions versus the research intensives. And we haven't yet talked about China and the way they go, and we haven't talked about what's going to happen in Japan. So, yeah, Nelson Memo, if you're 5%, if you're 10%, if you're 15% of your output covered by the OSTP mandate or the guidelines, that's not sufficient yet to understand where you need to invest in your business. And again, coming back to leadership at scale, one of the big things I hear from smaller presses and standalone societies is we're not even at the table yet. We haven't had that experience yet. We haven't been invited to talk to these funders. And so that's a thing I worry about, is I worry about accessibility in the Global South. I worry about everybody getting a seat at the table. I worry about the support that people will need when they go to try these things on and to meet these various requirements. We're not in a big deal era anymore with one big business model. We're in a very, very, very beautifully, wonderfully complex, diverse, new ecosystem, which is going to stand up a whole bunch of new opportunities. But we have to figure out a way to let others have a voice at the table.
I was going to turn to you, Stephen. I would imagine you share some of those same sentiments, and you've written quite a bit about transformative agreements as being, in terms of, you know, how do we bring together that fragmentation? I think you've seen transformative agreements as one way forward in this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Jay said it well. There's and everybody at the moment is very keen on focusing on their differences rather than their common ground, and perhaps as publishers in the past, we've been more like that as well, and we're trying to find now our common ground. We need the organisations on the other side of the table to also try and find more common ground. We've done many transformative agreements. As much as we give them all the same name, behind the scenes, they're different. They require not just a more in-depth conversation, because they're not cookie cutting, they're individual by nature. But also what then happens is there's a whole set of systems development that then follows on, because effectively what the organisations on the other side of the table are doing is outsourcing compliance and risk. They are saying, publishers, you authenticate, you measure, you report, and if you do something wrong, you're penalised, but you have to do it right, and you have to do it right all the time, and that's fine, but if as an industry we're all going to go through those investments in duplication, it might be some of the big houses can afford to do it, but this industry will further suffer and consolidate as a result. So I think it's beholden on all of us to try and help everybody find the common ground. This is about making things open and accessible and reusable for the research community. It doesn't have to have every single flavour under the sun. At the end of the day, I think we all agreed it needs to be funded in some shape or form because it costs money to do it. But the form of funding doesn't have to be so different. Transformative agreements, in my view, are a very, very important tool, though, for repurposing the existing money that sits in the system that have been historically paid for subscriptions to be able to be utilised for open access. And when you bring, on occasions, grant money in, then you need to look at multi-payer models in order to be able to facilitate that. But once you start going beyond that, you get into varieties where everybody's keener on showing how they're different rather than finding the expedient way to get a cost-effective solution rolled out as quickly as possible. So I think we've got to get the demand side better aligned to a common supply approach. Whoever the organisations are that are doing that supply, it's in all of our interests to have much more common ground. And the transformative agreements are a great way of doing that. The danger is at the minute that they're morphing into every shape and form imaginable.
So in addition to the multiple questions we ask upon submission, we're also going to create all these deals that in the background are shaped differently. Judy, you look like you've been wanting to jump in there.
No, well, again, it's just interesting. I mean, when you look at TAs, it is not a one-size-fits-all, but our opportunity is it can't be a different flavor for every single customer in terms of the complexity from a publisher and society side, but also there will be complexity from the customer side too. So we've got to figure that out. And I think that even ties in with your earlier comments, Jay, as you look at infrastructure, that would be a key enabler. It's interesting when you talk about tipping point for OA, I mean, it's already 30% open access. That's definitely past tipping point. But when you look back with OSTP, I mean, 25% of all publications that are US federally funded are open access already. So when you think about implications here, I think it's not as huge as we think they are, and to your other comments in terms of percentages from each of us that are tied into that. So to me, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us, but it gets to the details that Mandy hit on. It has to be a gold open future because that's sustainable. If it's not, that's where we start to, I think, run into, I always call them opportunities. Yeah.
And I see others nodding. Mandy, you're nodding as well.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a number of points. I mean, so we're expecting to hit 50% open access for our research content this year, which, considering where we were a few years ago, is a massive change for us. And it's also important to note there that we're 60% HSS content. So this is a big impact for us. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the scale that you guys do. But I think something that, Stephen, you were saying about transformative agreements, the clue is in the name as well, that they're transformative. And I think part of the problem that you're addressing as well is that the whole industry is at different stages here. So some people are just starting to think about how to get into, and address open access and support open access. Others of us are further along that and are thinking about the next phase of of transformative agreements and what are those going to look like. We're also now starting to think about what are the weaknesses of this shift. how do we ensure equity for authors is a big, big topic, and I think, Jay, you touched on that, and making sure that by reducing the barrier to access, we're not going to create a barrier to publish. And again, as a strong HSS publisher, that's a real concern for us. We have a lot of independent scholars as our authors, and making sure that when the world has shifted to transformative and pay-to-publish agreements, how are they going to be supported to publish is a big topic for us. We've also, as a HSS strong publisher, got a lot of non-research content. What's the model going to be that supports that content on an ongoing basis? This is a significant proportion of what we do. So we've got this sort of strong momentum pushing us, but we've also got all of these challenges, and I think to the points that have been made, we're all going to come up with slightly different solutions to those because the shape and size of our programs is different.
It's a learning journey we're all on.
And and the final point I was going to make, it was all of this shift, and again, thinking about change at scale, the change is really at scale for all of us, and it's affecting everything. We've talked about systems, but I think the roles that we're all doing is changing. We think about the role of a salesperson, used to be a negotiation. Now they're having to talk about data, they're having to talk about authors, they're having to talk about all of these content issues that they never had to engage with before. Who we're marketing to, how we bring our society partners on in this journey. Very different conversations. So I think, again, maybe something collectively we're all seeing is the skill sets that we need within our organisations and how we train and engage people. I think that's going to be something that we're all seeing as about change in our industry.
And I just want to make a mention, because on stage here, although, Mandy, your organization is smaller than the other three here, we have, of course, members in STM that are much, much smaller. And I think we heard a talk earlier today from Subscribe to Open. There's already, a couple hundred publishers that are working through that model. So I think also when we're talking about gold, we're not just talking about one model with transformative agreements, though that is one that's really important for some, but there may be other models that are going to be necessary for us to get there. So since that view's not here on stage, I just want to put that in the mix.
Could I just add that we've understandably, because of the scale probably of our businesses, we talk a lot about journals and articles, but that OSTP announcement, let's not forget, also covers federally funded books or book chapters, conference proceedings. And when they say open data, they're meaning open code as well as open data and open protocols and methods and so on. So both the scope of which this will be the case, and for many, especially smaller publishers, there's much more mixed between books and journals and events. So sometimes it gets a bit distorted for some of us where we're so journals dependent. And at the moment, at least I get the sense from the memo and from the conversations we've had that no real thinking has gone on about what that means for all those other formats, whether it be about money or whether it be actually about the standards that need to be achieved. And I think there is an enormous, considering the deadlines, I think it's 4 months and 3 days to the time the large agencies need to report back on their draft plans to the OSTP. And for most of them, they haven't had the conversations with most of us in the room because they're not ready, and the clock is ticking, and I don't know how many of us are ready, but all of those need to be discussed because those plans will be being submitted, and it's going to be a lot harder to change them once they're submitted, even in draft form, than it will be to be able to make sure the plan that's submitted isn't poorly thought through or misunderstanding of some of the things that need to be undertaken in order for this transition to occur. So I just think that time actually at the minute matters very much about getting all of ourselves organised and joined up with our trade bodies in America, STM, to get clarity to the agencies because of the speed at which it will be happening, as well as in parallel the work above OSTP to Congress and the appropriations committees about the fact that there is going to need to be some money put behind this, if nothing else for the expansion in scope that's just been initiated through this memo.
Thank you. Let's just, we've got another 15 minutes, so I thought I might shift again, which doesn't mean we can't come back to some of these topics. But Jay, I wanted to turn to you because I think that Wiley is also shifting, at least it looks like way for those of us on the outside. So from not just publishing, but also publishing infrastructure. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that part of the business and that transition to becoming a service provider, or at least including that as part of what your business is involved in.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. I think the important thing to say is that, again, just coming back to the theme of this conversation, the thing I want to emphasize is that we've made an investment in what yesterday we announced as our partner solutions business to really enable the transition to open access. A lot of the topics that we've been talking about today are on the minds of a lot of the people in this room. And we had about 170 different conversations as we looked at the 400 partners that we already work with, just on infrastructure and support, to say nothing of the 900 partners we work with on the publishing side. And we took a series of decisions to sort of try and tackle the three key issues that they had, which were, how do we transition our business to open access? What are the things that we need to do that in terms of platforms and services, administration, support to do that? How do we integrate those solutions into a single whole to get better data out of it, so that we can then diversify our own revenue? There's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt in the conversations with many of you in the room and others around the sustainability of the annual meeting, around the future of the books program, around the shift of membership from west to east, pressure on revenue that is exacerbated by concerns around the shift to open access. And so by coming together to work on infrastructure, by coming together to work on new monetization opportunities, by coming together to work on taking cost out of the system and making our businesses more cost efficient, to free up money to invest, I think we find common cause with a lot of folks. And that's what we decided to do, in short, to help smaller organizations get big company economics. Because that scale is tremendously, tremendously important, elusive, and necessary in order to sustain our organizations, be they for-profit, not-for-profit, or somewhere in between. In order to sustain our organizations going forward, we need to be able to address those really fundamental questions. And because of who we are at Wiley, we didn't have any choice but to sort of, with our society publishing background and the way we view ourselves, we felt like this was the right move for us.
Any more questions on that? Thank you. We also have a few questions that came in from various folks that submitted these things in advance. And one question that we received that I'm going to throw out to the panel was, what change could the publishing industry deliver by collaborating together to help achieve the UN SDGs? Big question. And I know that you didn't have this in advance, so but perhaps you've had some thoughts about that.
I talked about this multiple times. I'm quite passionate about diversity and inclusivity, and I think there is tremendous opportunity for the publishing community to work together to ensure that underrepresented groups are represented, and whether that has to do with researchers from a gender perspective or from the global south, whether it has to do with research that is, especially if you look at medical research, which has been in the past predominantly been done on white males, and making sure that there's representation there, whether it's on gender representation on editorial boards. There's tremendous opportunity for us to collectively work together to do the right thing. And obviously, to do the right thing, you've got to understand where you are today, what the numbers tell you in terms of where you are today. You've got to paint a vision for the future in terms of where you want to go, and work really hard together to get there. And I am a huge believer, I mean, if if you're not measuring it, it clearly doesn't matter. So we've got to put firm stakes in the ground and go after it. So, yeah, so very passionate about it, to say the
Yeah,
least.
and I know that Elsevier has been doing, really leading the way in many ways with setting some of those KPIs. I'm wondering if you might just share some of the things that you're currently measuring for those who are perhaps grappling and trying to think about where do we start with all of this. It might be a smaller organization, but have an interest in that.
Yeah, and I believe it has to start internally, and one of the things that I've been incredibly impressed, and I've only been with Elsevier for 5 months, a little over 5 months and 1 week and 2 days, whatever it is, but the incredible focus internally on inclusivity and diversity, because I think just like anything, it has to start at home, and you've got to walk the talk. And so putting firm stakes in the ground in terms of measuring, important things like gender diversity internally, important things like looking at your editorial boards and what is the makeup from a gender perspective on your editorial board, and actually tracking to that and holding people accountable to that. I mean, those are really important first starts, and then taking it further to the community. And again, to my point, you've got to have the measurements, the data and analytics. There's been a tremendous amount of work done internally, so we can enable other partners, other publishers, academic communities to actually get underneath and start doing some measurement. So.
Matt, are there things that your organization are also doing similarly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, on the EDI perspective, we actually go EDIB, so we include the word belonging in there because we think that sense of ensuring everyone has a sense of belonging is incredibly important. I agreed wholeheartedly with everything that Judy was saying. The more we can be doing both in our organisations and fostering that change in our publishing, the two should go hand in hand, and we've got to be really driving, and I agree about measuring. It's really hard.
It's hard, but
really
important.
hard. Again, it comes back to the data, and that might be something else that, working out how best to do that. But yeah, I totally agree with that. When you asked about SDGs, I have to say my mind went somewhere else to start with. I was thinking about carbon reduction.
Climate.
And I was, the place that my mind started to go to was actually picking up, my brain made connections and was thinking about open. And the fact that open data, the more that we're not having to restore data in multiple places, we can have it available in one place and not be, put in across multiple sites. That's better from an energy point of view. How we understand what we're doing with our content, digital products we're building. Do we all understand the impact of putting videos on our sites and how the sites are built and what that means in terms of the energy consumption of the products by our users? A lot of these things, we're just starting to do some of this work, and I have to say it's quite complex, and I suspect it's something that a lot of small publishers won't be able to do. So again, how we share the understandings that we gain about what we're doing and how we can improve our products so that they are better from an energy point of view. I think that's something we can work together on. But also, the simple thing of travel. How we all talk to each other. Do we have to go to all of these events? I'm sorry, we're all sat here enjoying this, and it's lovely to be together. But I suspect there will be some change in behaviours, and that's going to be a critical part as well of how we all work together. So I'm sure there will be some things that we have to. Again, I don't think that any of the SDG areas should be things we compete on. Those should be things we should collaborate on for the benefit of what we're trying to do collectively. So the more we can share, whether it's on EDIB, whether it's on carbon reduction, that's got to be a focus for us, because I don't think it should be something we should be competitive over.
Yeah, a great example of the collaboration, I just want to thank the Royal Society of Chemistry publicly for their work on the joint commitment and bringing that to the fore. I really do think that we have an obligation on the publishing side to remove those structural barriers that exist to bringing content and authorship from everywhere in the world to the fore in our best titles and in our titles that are most widely read and most widely cited. And that starts with reckoning with the gatekeeping role that editorial boards who have had consistently for, call it 400 years, a relatively similar makeup. And so programs around diversification of editorial boards, programs around diversification of the peer review cohort, and then standing up new folks with decision rights are crucial. They're absolutely crucial to changing those structural imbalances. It's also crucial to address this issue of equity of access to publishing services. Transformational agreements in the Global South notwithstanding, and we're proud to have done a couple of those already, but there will be folks who, in a pure gold environment, just simply won't have access to those publishing services, and that's an unintended consequence of, I think, what is generally a very good thing, which is the migration to open. But the last thing I want to say is that I think we can all get really excited about the core mission. The core mission is to publish research in vaccines and research in water and food security and research in batteries and research in all kinds of new technology that can help directly impact the climate issue, but also issues around human rights, around economic development. And that's what all of us do collectively when we bring great scholarship to the world. And if we do it in an open way, what an impact it can have. You know, widely we talk about unlocking human potential as our mission, but this potential, when unlocked, has a real transformative impact on just about everything. And so I get very excited by the content, again, coming back to what we actually do and what our authors and researchers do. That's something we, I believe, as an industry, can rally around more because it is nothing short of crucial, and it saves lives and it changes lives.
And I think we have to rally around more measuring to show that impact, because it's easy to talk about it, it's easy to use the words, but to get to the actually what the benefits are and fact-based. So.
I couldn't agree more with my colleagues from the other
right
publishing
honourable
houses up here. But just going back to the question on SDGs more generally and what we could do together, because I think many of these things are inherently things that we generally have to start internally ourselves separately and then can take to more broadly, although changing how academic boards and so on are comprised, created and developed is clearly a much broader enterprise. But what I really wanted to say was that when you look at the nature of the most progressive work in the SDGs area, climate change is the obvious one to start with, but it pervades across, sustainable oceans, life underwater and food security, etc. Is something that we heard earlier today from, I think, both Peter and Matt, and that's this transdisciplinary aspect. And if you look at us as publishers, the vast majority of our journals were not created in a time of transdisciplinary research. They were much more discipline and faculty structured based. And when you look at how to bring people together, and part of what I think many of us intend our journals to do is to bring people together around common approaches, is they're not very well set up for that. And I'm not sure that we want to launch thousands of new journals across thematic areas, and it will take too long, and we're in a bit of another, I seem to be a bit obsessed today with the clock ticking on us on everything, but it never more so than on climate change. But I think if we could, across publishers, find a way of better using, if you like, the markup of articles to allow and book chapters and other conference proceedings and allow them to be reformed around thematic areas to a constant standard, rather than aggregating our content and doing it all in one place, we could all better facilitate those communities coming together and really getting the content that's embedded in journals that they're not familiar with into one place where it's accessible. And it does mean combining tools, not just some metadata being added, but with the right metadata. I'm sure there's partners out there that can work with us, perhaps some of my other publishers have already people working on it inside. But I think that would be something that every single organisation in this room could help propel forward the changes that are possible if we can mobilise the content and the people and the tools in the best way.
Yeah, and can I just add one other thing too? Especially as you look at climate change and sustainability from a climate side of the equation, with all the great research being done there, being able to mine the data on a country-specific level, so you can truly understand what the research that's being funded within that country, what it is, and how to enable that to drive policy, because I think that's a tremendous opportunity to drive transformational change.
That's a wonderful point for us to start rounding off things. And I want to just ask everyone, please just remain there for a few more moments. I'm going to thank the panel, but I also want to share with you a little bit of information. So let me first turn back to the panel before I give you the information. I just want to make sure people didn't start running out of the room here to get their drinks. I think some of the themes that I've been hearing in our conversation this afternoon is there's a lot of really hard work to be done. There are a lot of really, really tough issues, and there always have been, but somehow they're even more complex. They're in many ways more fragmented today than they were. And yet, what is very hopeful, I think, is the other theme, the other side of that is there's a much greater focus on how might we collaborate, which was a big thing throughout this conference today. But let's really think about where we want to compete, and let's really think about where we don't want to compete, because it's in the best interest of everyone to come together. And I think that gives us a real hope. I think the other thing that really came through here, and I think also through many of the presentations today, is that we, as publishers, really share in this passion of what we do really, really matters in the world. And that's why it's important for us to lean into these really important, these really difficult issues and try and find the way forward. So I want to thank Mandy and Jay and Judy and Stephen for joining me on stage. So I'd like you to please give them oh, yes, please. Yes, you can. Please, one last comment.
A really important comment on collaboration. I just want to acknowledge my friend Jay Flynn in spirit of partnership and collaboration. I hope you noticed that he wore an orange shirt in Elsevier colors. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge that. Great.
That's strong work.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
Allow me
resist.
to retort. I think I wanted to say, it's Caroline's first STM meeting.
Yes.
And I think she deserves a round of applause.